Okay. Hi, everyone. Cheryl Arkle, and this is a very special evening for us. We are in conversation with Leigh Straw. Hi, Leigh, all the way from
Hi.
Fremantle.
Good to be here. Lovely to see you again too. Really nice to. We've had chats over the years. Been great.
We have had a few chats, haven't we, in the office back when? Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Better Reading. Cheryl Arkle, chatting with Leigh Straw. If you'd like to make some comments, if you'd like to ask some questions, you know what to do. Just type them in. Leigh's with us tonight. She's live. We're all live. She's live from Fremantle, and she's here to talk about her new book called The Ballroom Murder. It struck me, Leigh, while I was reading this book, that you obviously this is a specialisation, writing nonfiction and writing crime, and that you are able to find cases that no one's ever heard of.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like there was kind of a group of us. I guess there was people in the archives and a few others around me who we'd heard about this story. It was one that I'd known for quite a few years. But I kind of made assumptions that maybe other people would know about it. It was so sensational at the time. But it's one of those stories that went quiet, really went quiet. Over here in WA, we obviously have every now and then it kind of pops up as a newspaper story of, stories from the past kind of thing. But at a national level, it wasn't very well known. And even like I've got people who've been coming up to me saying, I had no idea this happened in Perth of all places in 1925. Because, Perth is this little sleepy place, right?
Okay, well, let me welcome everybody, and then I'm going to ask you to tell us what the book is about, right? Welcome, everyone. Cheryl Arkle, Leigh Straw. We're here this evening. We're live. We're really happy to take comments. We're happy to take questions. Anything you want to ask Leigh, anything you want to ask me, feel free. So we've got a few people. Jessica is with us and says hi. Sharon says hi. Christine is from Ballarat and says hi. Sally says hi. Carolyn says hi. These are really familiar names to me because they're often joining our Thursday segment, which is Thursday at 2:00. What are you reading? Okay, we've got Wendy, who's joining us from Wagga Wagga, and Kiddenty, I think her name is, has said it's a great book, so she's read it already. Claire Miller, she's at your end, I'd say, and she says hi. And Bronwyn Lowe says hi. Okay, now welcome everybody. And Leigh now is going to talk about the Ballarat murders.
Beautiful, thank you.
Sorry,
Let me do a little.
I
Got Ballarat in the brain.
The ballroom murder. Sorry about that. I thought for a minute.
I'm sure we'll find one from Ballarat. I'm going to do a shout out because Kidenti, who's coming up, I'm pretty sure that's you, Lawson, my 12-year-old, who's online.
Okay.
My beautiful child. So the ballroom murder it's a fascinating story about a murder that takes place at Government House in Perth in August of 1925. Now, this is Perth, which is pretty sleepy at the time. Not a lot happens in terms of major crimes, or there's not really an organised crime scene like you would know from Sydney and Melbourne in the 20s and 30s. So it's a bit different that way. So when things happen in Perth, it is sensational. So in August of 1925, what happens
and I would say also, sorry to interrupt, Leigh, but when you've got a small population or a smaller population, I guess it feels more intimate that, there's very few people and it's happening with, in a smaller community. And I think it's scarier when that happens.
Yeah, and there's more of an inclination for people to know more people too.
Yes.
That still happens here. So there's this evening in August of 1925, and it's the St John of God annual ball. So the hospital has an annual ball to raise money for the community and particular charities. And it's a pretty standard event that takes place each year. There's police around the various parts of Government House. They have to protect it because obviously it's the governor's residence. And so there's two young women who walk into the event. They're in fancy dress. They're going to have a nice night out by all means, it seems. But the night takes a drastically different turn when one of the young women, Audrey Jacob, who is a 20-year-old art student, she sees her ex-boyfriend. He's there enjoying the attentions of other women and having a good time, and her whole demeanor completely changes. And so later in the evening, she tells her friend that she's going back to where she's staying in the city at that time. She needs to leave, and her friend's a bit concerned because the friend lives in Fremantle. She wants to get the kind of last public transport home at the time, the Charabanc as it's known. And then when Audrey comes back to the ball, there's still lots of people who are there on the dance floor, they're around Government House. It's the early hours of the next morning. And she turns up in a blue evening dress. She walks across the dance floor. Her eyes are fixed on Cyril Gidley, who's 25, and he's her ex-boyfriend, or fiance as the story goes. She walks across the dance floor. She's got a revolver. It only takes one shot. She fires at Cyril. Within minutes, he's dead. He's fallen to the floor. He's rushed off to the cloakroom, and he's passed away. We've got a 20-year-old art student still there on the dance floor with the gun in her hand while the police descend onto the dance floor. And for all intents and purposes, it seems like a open and shut case for the police officers. Here's the person who's fired the shot. They're there. They've got the weapon. They've unfortunately got a dead young man in the cloakroom, but that's not how the story unfolds, which makes it really fascinating.
It's so fascinating. A few more welcomes. Alona, and she's from freezing Victoria. It's a bit cold in Sydney. I don't know what it's like in Perth. It's taken a turn here. Or you're in Fremantle, actually, aren't you?
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's nice today. Sorry if you're cold. It's very nice in Fremantle.
Paveen says hi. Louise says good evening from Sydney. Leigh says, how long does it take to do the research for your books? That's a good question to start with.
That's a great question. And I often get asked it. It sometimes can depend on the project itself. You might find that there's a project that takes 2 to 3 years to properly research because it's quite intricate. Or there might be a project where I've been doing bits and pieces over a while. So the main research might only take 6 months to a year. But it usually takes a substantial amount of time to really put it all together. I'm trained as a historian, so I've got the professional training to be able to go through the archives, to know what I need to do. It does take a while, but at the same time, like, life is very real, and it's very real for me that it really just depends on life circumstances, full-time work, and I've got 3 boys, so I've got 3 little fellas that make life very, very interesting and a whole load of fun. So sometimes the research, as I say, 6 months to a year. Sometimes it's longer. It can take 2 to 3 years. But I usually do the research while I'm writing as well. So I kind of do them corresponding to each other.
And I can imagine too, it's what you can get hold of, how much information is out there, and finding that information. Is it newspapers that are the greatest source of information to you? How do you really get a hold of the story?
Yeah, newspapers are really useful, as we all know, and people coming into the session will understand that. Through Trove, because we've got the digitization of the old newspapers, it's there at your fingertips. So it's made it a lot easier to actually do that research of newspapers. Years ago, I had to go to the State Library, had to go through the microfilm, and get very sick going through the microfilm. I'm very seasick in a way. So that's made things a bit easier. Newspapers are a great resource, absolutely. You get the sensationalism, you get photographs, you get a real sense of what the public was trying to make of different cases. But a lot of my research is police records, police files, prison registers, court documents, inquests, things like that. So I'll tend to do the archival research alongside doing the newspaper research as well.
How accurate do you think the information is that you are looking at? I mean, is there a time where you read a piece of information and think that's not quite right?
It's dependent on, when you look at newspapers, they generally have good information, but as with any source, you have to cross-reference. So I could have newspaper stories, then I'll compare them to what the police records say, what's said in the courts. But the thing is that with anything from the past, with any of the records of the past, we can only use the evidence that's there. There's always gaps, there's always silences, and you can't do anything with that. So sometimes you have a lot of questions that you want to find in the archives and you just don't get the answers.
Did you find, I think I'm asking all the questions here, but I will go back to the questions because there's so many questions I've got in my head, and I will give everybody at home a chance. Cheryl Arkle, I'm speaking to Leigh Straw about her wonderful book. It's nonfiction. It's called The Ballroom Murder, and we're talking about that now. One of my other questions was, does she have any descendants? Were you able to speak to people that are living now and what they know about her?
Yeah, the interesting thing about Audrey Jacobs' story is it's a bit different to other works that I've done, particularly in true crime, where, Kate Leigh's great nephew, I had a chat with him about what he thought about his great aunt. He's got great stories to tell, so there are still people who are around. But with this story, Audrey Jacobs' family ended up being quite private. And I really found that I wanted to tell the story of what happened that night, what happens in the aftermath, and so on. But I left it open-ended in case any family wanted to come forward, because I just felt that it was it had become quite a private thing for them. It was so horribly sensational. It was a terrible thing to have happened. She's the person who's committed this murder. And so for her family and her brothers and sisters, I imagine they would have really just kind of kept to themselves pretty much afterwards, because of the devastating nature of what had taken place. So it's different to how I've worked before. I kind of just wanted to allow family to come forward if they want to, and do it in a respectful way.
And what about in terms of the victim? Did you find any descendants from him come forward?
Well, hey, Cyril Gidley had family in England. So when all this unfolds, his mum and dad are still around. He's still got family. And they're just waiting for updates all those thousands of miles away. And I found that quite a sad thing, because they couldn't get over to Western Australia. They couldn't see him. Their grief was at a distance. So yes, there's still family members who are around. And again, that's another aspect of the story where if people want to come forward, fantastic.
Okay, all right, let me see what we've got here. Louise says, good evening from Sydney. What have we got? Hello from Victoria, Lynette. Hello from Melbourne. We've got people from all over the country. What have we got? Wendy says it sounds intriguing. Christine says the cover of the book is very appealing. Carol's got a question. How do you type a book? Do you handwrite or do you type?
I'm pretty old school, because I was trained, as I say, as a historian, and I went through university many, many years ago. Those were the days where I was still typing like papers on an electric typewriter. I've got old typewriters too, which I have a lot of fun with. But in terms of putting it together, I write lots of notes. When I'm in the archives, I'm writing notes, because I like having the written copies, so that I don't just rely upon everything on a computer. So I'll put notes together, and then I do start writing passages, but I'm pretty stock standard. I would use Word as a program. There's a lot of other programs you can use, and my lovely husband is trying to open me up to that world of different things to use, but I like Word, and it works for me. And so that's how I put the books together. But I always have the notes that are handwritten and the printed off material and so on as well.
Okay, so we've got Cheryl, who says hi from Newcastle. Great name, Cheryl. Heather, who is joining us from Scotland. So there we go. We've got people from all around the country. Okay,
that's my Auntie Heather.
Oh, Auntie Heather. Hello, Auntie Heather. Thank you so much. Because it must be probably very early morning over there, I'd imagine. Okay, all right. I've got some questions for you. When you did your research, and I often wonder this with nonfiction research, do you follow a character and you're learning so much about them, and of course you develop a relationship with them, right? Is there a point where you think, I like this person or I don't like this person?
Yeah, look, I mean, well, to be honest, over the years, I've researched a fair bit for work, and just for my own research of the Kennedys and Robert Kennedy in particular, and that's always a joy. But that's very different to the historical works that I've put together, the true crime. Yes, there's individuals that draw you in. I've previously done some work in terms of returned servicemen from World War I. So I read a lot of their repatriation files, and there was men that I followed their journey, and it was so heartbreaking. And you really are drawn into the very human experience. That's what we do in the telling of stories. It's about people. And when it's true, it's so very real. And I guess especially coming to this case, there's people who have very particular opinions about Audrey and trying to figure her out. And I wanted to figure her out. I wanted to make sense of who was she, why did she do this, what's going to draw me into, and I wanted to understand Cyril Gidley as well as the victim, certainly in the case. And what I was able to do was to just really present the evidence as it's there in that professional manner. And I don't know, I'm not really drawn into with Audrey whether I like her or not. I just wanted to kind of figure out why she did it. In the aftermath of it, I've been known to be drawn into individuals finding like a Kate Leigh character for true crime. You know, Kate Leigh, organised crime figure, and I certainly learned about her from living in Sydney for a while. She was somebody that there was aspects of where I did kind of like her. I liked her feistiness, I liked her toughness, but I didn't like the violence associated with her life. So I think sometimes where you have these really interesting individuals, you can be drawn into their story, but at the same time you have to distance a little bit from it too.
Mm. Do you feel a responsibility to be so true to them, because you are really you are their voice in a book like this, and do you feel that you really have to be true to who they were?
As true as I possibly can, yeah, and putting all the material, the records together, the evidence, yeah, I have to present as accurate a representation of that past as possible. That's what we do with telling the stories of the past, and if you do it in a professional way, that's absolutely what you need to do. But I think there is that I am sort of held to that, for sure. But I mean, I have my own opinions of what I think of people that might not necessarily go into books. And what I really like to do is to allow readers to make their own minds up. That's the beautiful interplay that we have, because you're a reader, I'm a reader, we love books. And so I like to set up my books in the sense that I'll present the information, but I also leave it open-ended in the sense that readers can make up their own minds. And that's the real active engagement with the stories.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Cheryl Arkle, we're live. We're here tonight on Facebook Live. I'm in conversation with Leigh Straw. We're talking about the ballroom murder. I've got a question here from Louise. Do you think that Arthur Haynes was able to get the not guilty verdict for Audrey because he manipulated the press? Well, you need to give us some background about Arthur, and then let's run with the question.
Yeah, sure. Arthur Haynes, he was very well known as a lawyer in Western Australia in the early 20th century. He interestingly represented a number of women who worked on Rose Street and in the brothels there. So he often helped out people who might not always necessarily be able to afford his legal fees, but he would help them out. So he's quite an interesting character in that way. Came from a legal family. His father had a pretty prominent legal background as well. So he's known in the legal community at the time. He likes chasing big cases that give him a bit of prominence, but also give him the challenge of defending clients like Audrey Jacob and other cases he was involved in. The really interesting thing about that, and Louise's question is fantastic, is what you uncover in this story is when Audrey shoots Cyril on the dance floor, the editor of the Mirror newspaper, Victor Courtney, was there. He was one of the guests. So this is unfolded right in front of the editor of the Mirror newspaper. He immediately thinks, this is terrible. He rushes to help, obviously. But you could also think, as the editor of a newspaper, he's already thinking, this is a big story. This is a big story. So what's the connection between him and Audrey's defense lawyer? They are friends. They're very friendly. And so Arthur Haynes would feed information to Victor Courtney, and in feeding that information to Victor Courtney, that would find its way into the newspapers. Then you create public sympathy for your client. And so that's what we see in the newspapers. In the Mirror newspaper in particular is a lot of favorable stories about Audrey. And Cyril starts to be painted not as the victim, but actually more as a perpetrator, more as somebody who's pretty problematic. And so that was Haynes's use of the media, which is the 1920s and still occurs today.
It really is still the case today. I mean, that's, it's judgment by media, and we often talk about that. Tell us a little bit more about Audrey, just her background, because, I mean, we would all be upset if we found out that our partner, our fiance, our husband, was having friendships, relationships with other women. But, not many of us are going to go home, get a gun and come back and shoot him in front of however many people. So what makes her that person?
And that's the big question in this story. That's how I started out. I wanted to figure out who she was based on what I could uncover. I mean, if this hadn't happened in August of 1925, Audrey Jacob would have pretty much just continued on like a young woman, a flapper, of the 1920s, enjoying friendships with men, enjoying, friendships with women, and kind of pushing the boundaries of the time, of dressing a little bit differently, smoking, having the odd drink sort of thing of its time. And I think maybe she would have carried on with art. Maybe she would have got a different job. Who knows? I think she probably would have continued along the lines of a pretty, I guess, a normal kind of life. But what changes this is that Audrey, she meets Cyril, and she becomes very close to him. The story is that they get engaged, and then the engagement is broken off, and they part ways. And yet, while she's also been known to still carry on seeing friends and so on, there's something about Cyril that makes her have this moment of where she just really changes. And she sees him at that ball, and she decides that she's going to go get the gun, and she's going to shoot Cyril Gidley. She's got that in her head, and she follows that through. But really, she was a young woman who lived relatively kind of standard life in Fremantle. Her dad's a clerk of courts. She's looked after her younger siblings. She's also followed her dad's job around the state because he got jobs in different country towns. And there's nothing that sort of really stands out about her other than here we have this young woman who turns up at the ball and shoots her ex-lover dead.
Where would she have gotten the gun from?
That's the interesting thing as well, because to have a gun at that time is not really, like in Perth especially, it's not something you'd be known to do. It's not common. It's not like a young woman can go get a gun and then leave it in her apartment to go collect later on. The stories that are there that the gun was given to her, one story was it was given to a previous relationship, that her mum had got the gun. Her mum sends the gun up from Fremantle, sends the gun up to Perth, where Audrey was staying as a single woman at the time, which again is another way of pushing the boundaries. And maybe she sent it because it was a bit of safety, that Audrey could look after herself. The big question mark is there. The gun is, if she doesn't have the gun, there's no way she could have shot Cyril Gidley. So that's the backstory to that, in terms of was it protection, or is there something else that's going on?
Well, and also to be able to use the gun, to stand there and shoot somebody from a distance, that can't be easy either if you've never used a gun.
Yeah. So had she tried it out before? That's another part of the story, that there's a gap.
Okay. Another question from Louise. Do you believe that the letter found in Cyril's house was a forgery?
Look, one thing that came out of doing the research was that his parents were very keen for the letter to be returned to them. They saw this as a key part of their son's life and, of course, what unfolds. And the authorities held on to it here because it's obviously a part of a very prominent murder case. Look, the defense would have you believe that it was a forgery, that suddenly it pops up when the police are going through and looking for material, belongings, anything to further implicate Audrey. I don't think it was a forgery, but then I'm a little bit biased because I tend to go on the end of thinking the police were doing their job. They were looking for evidence. They would do it in the most professional way possible. Doesn't always play out in that manner, but the police officers that I researched, there was nothing to say that there was anything corrupt going on in the work that they were doing. They were pretty standard police officers who'd been in the job for a long time, and their police files showed a pretty good career. So I didn't find anything there that could have hinted that it would have been a forgery. The other thing too is, from the outset, the police think it's an open and shut case. This is willful murder. She's there on the dance floor. They've got witnesses. Why would they need to create this forgery? That's a great question.
Yeah, it is a really good question. Jel says, hello, I'm here. For all of you that are joining us now, Cheryl Arkle, Leigh Straw, we're talking about her book, The Ballroom Murder. Any questions or comments, please feed them through. If you miss this event live tonight, because we are live at this point, you can always watch it. All the videos that all the conversations we have with authors are recorded as well. Okay, so what was the perception? What was it that that Arthur Hayes? What was it that he was putting out into the media that swayed public opinion?
Well, what swayed public opinion is, look, first of all, he's got a good client to work with. She's an attractive 20-year-old art student. Immediately, in looking at that, you think, okay, this can be favorable. And it always made me think about, imagine if she hadn't been a young non-Indigenous art student. Imagine if we'd had an Indigenous woman who was up on this charge. I just keep thinking, well, somebody of another background, it would have been a very different situation. So he already has a good client to work with. How he's able to sway public opinion is that he very carefully turns Audrey into the victim. And that's what I had to be a little bit careful around and very respectful around as well, because the case that's put forward is that Cyril Gidley was very manipulative, that he had threatened the family, that he was telling the family about Audrey's father having affairs. And that really put a strain on her parents' marriage, though they came together in support of Audrey through the inquest and the trial. So Haynes is portraying this really a family that has been manipulated by Audrey's ex-boyfriend. And so what you see happening is that Audrey comes to the fore more and more as the victim in that relationship. And then Cyril is receding from view as the victim in the case and more of somebody that you wouldn't really trust and you're second guessing. But the thing about it is that we don't have Cyril's perspective, of course, because he is the person who was murdered. We don't really have a full idea of him and the evidence from his family, from a lot of friends. We do have people who worked with him on the ships who said he was a pretty regular 25-year-old. And we also have a couple of his close friends who lived in Fremantle. They gave evidence at the inquest and the trial, again, that they didn't think that he was this kind of manipulative person. They didn't see that side of him. They just saw him in a relationship with Audrey. That relationship broke up and he continued on as a 25-year-old young man.
I mean, I guess, and I don't know what the mood was around 1920, but, there's, did the question of mental health arise?
That's also another one of the gaps that comes up in a lot of the records, because even I've done research looking into women who were charged with drunkenness, soliciting, vagrancy, as it was called at the time, of living on the streets. And you could see in the recidivism with these women that they kept coming back through the courts. They do their 6 months in prison, come out of prison, and then they'd end up back in the court system. And with some of the testimony they give, with some of their reactions, there was questions about what else is going on here. There has to be mental health issues associated with these women's lives. But these questions are not really asked at the time because the mental health of individuals is not really taken into account. So if you look at Audrey, if you imagine if she were to go to trial today, there would be a lot of questions around her mental state at the time. How well was she? All these sort of things. Now, it was the police prosecutor had asked Arthur Haynes, the defense lawyer, if they were going to raise the issue of her mental state, and that the defense lawyer said no, they were going to leave that alone. And that was interesting in the archives to come across that little bit of correspondence. But again, these are the gaps in the path in terms of looking at cases and mental health issues. It's just not really taken into account, and sometimes still the case.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, from Louise, do you think religion played a part in the public's perception of Audrey? It's a good question, isn't it?
Sure. I mean, if you're finding that you're reading in the newspapers, if I was to transport myself back to 1925 and I'm reading the newspapers that are coming out that Saturday or whatever, if I was to read those stories about a young art student and she had studied at a convent, that she learned how to paint at the convent, that she was a very religious young woman, I might be more predisposed to being sympathetic towards her. A society then too that was in some respects connected to these religious backgrounds, perhaps that would have certainly swayed it. I think it would have affected the public's perception. But of course, that's another part of the craftiness of her defense lawyer, was her Catholicity. To say she converted to Catholicism, I mean, this is the thing. It came out later on that she actually converted to Catholicism, or apparently did so, very close to the trial. Now, you don't just easily convert to Catholicism. It's not something that happens quickly. There's a whole process that goes with this, many ceremonies, many things, many meetings, and so on. So later on, once the police prosecutor, Parker, once he learned, in fact, that this was a bit of a fabrication of the defense case, he was really frustrated by that. He didn't know that at the time.
Oh, I can imagine. Now, can you believe it, Leigh? We're out of time. Thank you to all the people that joined us tonight, all the comments, your wonderful comments. And thank you so much, Leigh Straw. I was going to ask very quickly, do you think you'll ever write fiction?
You might want to ask my publisher, see what they think. I think I love writing nonfiction because of my, historian's background. I love reading fiction. And I think it's for that reason that I like doing the nonfiction and the true crime, and I just leave the fiction for my own pleasure. I think that's where it's at. But I don't know. Who knows? It's maybe.
Maybe. Okay. So this is the book. I've got a copy right here. It's up there on the screen too, The Ballroom Murder. You can purchase it from us or any bookstore in your area. Leigh Straw, thank you so much. It was incredibly interesting. And again, thank you to everybody at home.
Thank you, everyone.